Well, if this is your first week here, or if it's your 101st week here, we're just glad that you decided to be with us. In this discussion, in this series, we're actually in part 2. So you're right in the beginning. If you haven't watched the first one, we recommend you go back and see that one. If you're sitting in a group tonight or during the day and you are with a whole bunch of people and this is week 2, I'm just excited to get started with our series Explained. And we said last week that this series is for anyone who reads the Bible and gets bored, or has read the Bible in the past and gotten bored, reads the Bible and feels confused by what's in it, reads the Bible but might feel like they're about to close it, maybe for the last time, might read the Bible and isn't sure how to get started with it. And this one we've added at the end after talking to groups and leaders last week, which is reads the Bible but really doesn't feel anything. There's no tension, there's no confusion, there's no hatred, there's no love, there's just reading and the Bible. And so what we're going to do this week is clarify one more piece of the tension that you may have when you read the Bible, or maybe excite some of that tension that you don't feel for the Bible at all. And how I want to do that is start with a story, and it goes like this. A man was traveling with his wife, and he stopped in a city that he didn't live in. He was making a long journey, and he couldn't go any farther because it was nighttime, and they didn't want to go farther. So they stopped in a city that they didn't live in. And the men of that city attacked the man's wife so horribly that she died. And they left her there. And the husband went out in the morning and found his dead wife. He sent a message to the neighboring towns and cities because of what those men had done. It was in his country, but it was in a city he didn't live in, and he didn't appreciate what had happened to his wife. None of us would. But the country broke out in civil war against that one city. They had joined together. It was a couple 100,000 men in an army joined together and attacked that one city. And that city that attacked the man's wife lost after winning the first few battles, but lost massive casualties. And in the end, they lost the civil war. And the winning side promised that none of their daughters would marry any of the men from that city because of what they had done. In fact, before the Civil War broke out, they were so obstinate against what had happened, against being asked to apologize, that they said, no, we are not going to apologize. We're not going to hand over the guys who did this. There will be no justice for this, and everybody should just move on. So even when the war was over, the country that had united against the city decided no one from our towns and cities is going to marry anybody from your town and city. But after they'd said it, they felt bad about it. So they attacked a town that had not shown up for the battle. The entire country that had united against the city looked around, took a head count, and said, you know, there's been a few towns and places and cities that didn't show up for this big battle. Which one didn't? And so they find the town that didn't, and they took girls who weren't married from their own country, from the town and city close to them, and killed everyone else and gave the girls to the city that had lost. So if you weren't one of the girls that wasn't married, if you were a woman who was married or a husband, or if you were a child, you were killed, but the women were taken away and given to the city that had lost. After all of the horrible things that they had done, after being objecting towards being asked to apologize, they were given the women from a town that didn't attack them. But the losing side was short a few wives for their men. They looked around and said, we're a couple hundred short. And they told the winning side, we are a couple hundred short. And if you're going to make this right, then we need your help. And so the winning side told them, one of our towns is actually having a festival. One of the towns close by, they're having a festival. Every year it happens. And when the girls go out to dance, which happens every year, we want you to jump out from the bushes and catch them. We want you to hide in the bushes until you see them come out, and when they're dancing, we actually want you to run out and catch one for each of you. So if you don't have a wife, please go to that town, go to the bushes, hide. When they come out dancing, catch one. And they did. And then everyone went home. And that's where the story ends. Now, that's a pretty far-fetched story, but it's true. And one last twist, that story is actually from the Bible. Now, the details are a little fuzzy, and I didn't include all of them because, frankly, there's a few that I don't want to say from stage and I don't want recorded for all time. But if you look in the book of Judges in the last few chapters, you'll find this story there. And you'll find that it ends the book of Judges. Now, that makes it really awkward because the last time we were together and the last time in the last session, we started and ended with this. The point of the Bible is to know God better. Now, if you read that story, and then you look at what we proposed last week, which is the point of the Bible is to know God better, it can get pretty awkward. Because if you know God better from that story, then you've got something to teach me and a lot of other people who have read that story as well. In fact, I'm going to guess, like me, when you hear that story, when you read that story, like I have a few times, you may feel like you know God less than you did before you started that story. There's plenty of times when you read the Bible, and maybe there's parts of the Bible that you don't really understand. In fact, you may have more questions about it because of the way you read the Bible. So if you read the Bible for a weapon, after you read that story, you may actually find that you have a weaker weapon. Your arguments are weaker, and you have in fact strengthened the arguments that you're trying to defeat. If you're reading the Bible for a textbook, your position might be less strong than it was before you read it. If you're looking for support by reading it as a textbook, you might find that there's really nothing to support your claim in that story. If you're reading it as coffee, something warm to get you going during the day, there's nothing in that story, hopefully, that gets you warm and fuzzy and going for the day. So if we read the Bible for a different reason, or if we read the Bible because we want to know God better, things can get pretty awkward. But we prepared for that. In fact, we said we should be asking our questions, we should be expressing our doubts, we should be raising our objections, and we should be saying what we're thinking. So when we get to awkward parts of the Bible that are designed to help us know God better, and we're not quite sure how to do that, we should be prepared with questions, doubts, objections, and thinking. In fact, that might not be the first time you have all four of these about maybe another part of the Bible. Maybe you've read the story of Jonah, the book of Jonah, and the story of Jonah with the whale, and thought, how does it happen that a whale swallows Jonah? I'm not sure a human can survive in the belly of a whale, and how on earth does God justify just killing a city of people? I don't know if I can agree with this story. You might have thought all four of these about creation. Was it really 6 days? Did God actually create it? What about science? What about what the world says now in the origins of the universe? You might say this a lot about maybe Revelation. Maybe you read Revelation and what it's supposed to look like in the future, and all four of these come up. Now, that's natural because you're a rational person, and when you read things that are confusing, they continue to spin into more confusion when you don't get answers. And so tonight, what we want to do in this session, what we want to do is take away that confusion, or at least clarify some of the confusion surrounding it. By saying this, how we read the Bible is just important as why we read the Bible. We read the Bible to know God better, but how we read parts of the Bible is really important. But before I get to that, what I want to do is level the playing field. For some of you, this is actually going to feel like a whole lot of review, which is great because maybe you haven't heard this in a while. Maybe you've never heard this, but it's going to level the playing field for everybody. I remember this poster in my Sunday school class, in my youth group class, in maybe a few rooms around church, because this is classic and it's a great tool to understanding how the Bible is organized. In fact, this is going to be one of the points of clarity for us before we get to the big one, how we talk about the Bible. We talk about the Bible as if it's one big book that includes everything and was put together at the exact same time. But it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, the Bible is split up into two major sections. You have the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament being before Jesus, focused on the people of God, Israel. And you have the New Testament, which starts with Jesus and then describes him, his work, and the people who would come after him, following him. There's 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, and they have all of these other major genres. There's history, there's Gospels, there's letters, there's minor prophets, and there's prophecy in the New Testament as well. Now, when you look at all of these different parts and you look at these different distinctions, the reality is you don't read them the same way. There's poems in here, from God and to God. There's laws in all of this, and they're to people. Some of them are moral, some of them are religious, some of them are civic. Some of these are letters written to and from people in what is modern-day Iraq and Syria. They don't look like us, they don't act like us, and they don't have our culture. And so when you read them, when you find them in the Bible, they should be read differently than other parts of the Bible. And so what's drastically important when we read the Bible is context, because it changes how we read what's in the Bible. The purpose is that we get to know God better, but the context changes how we read it. And so what I want to show you is a few passages, a few parts that desperately need context to clear up some of the mystery of the Bible. Here's the first one, Philippians 4:13. This is written on shoes, it's written on bios on Instagram, and it's quoted a lot of times when people feel like they're trying to accomplish a goal or string a few good days together. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Now, you guessed it, we need context for this verse if we're actually going to understand it. And here's some of the points of context. Paul was in jail for his faith when he wrote this. He had already been captured, and he was sitting in jail, actually talking about his time in jail towards the end of the message, which is Philippians 4. He's talking about his time in jail, and he had just received money and support. In jail back then, you weren't just given 3 square meals a day. You weren't given multiple outfits. You weren't taken care of. There were no board games or books. There was no TV. There was none of that. If you couldn't provide for yourself while you were in jail, you just died. And so these people had actually supported Paul while he was in jail. And they didn't need to send him any more. He said, I'm not telling you these things so that you can send me more. In fact, if anything, I'm doing okay right now. And I have learned the secret to being content. Paul was fine no matter what. And the secret to being content in jail, no matter what was going on with him, and no matter how much money he had, no matter if he had a full stomach or an empty stomach, was, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. So it wasn't about stringing a few good days together. It wasn't about having a vision board and trying to accomplish those things and knowing that I can do it if Christ gives me strength. If anything, what this passage and the context around it supplies us with is the understanding that our circumstances mean nothing if Jesus is at the center of our faith. Not the hope that He'll make things work out the way I want them to. Context doesn't change the verse, but it does change our understanding. Here's another one, Jeremiah 29:11, another one we find often in Instagram bios. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And we love this verse. I love hearing this verse because I know it comes from God. Prosper you and not to harm you. And this is a lot like when we pray that God would give us a good day. We certainly have a definition of what would prosper us, and we have a definition of what would not harm us. But the people in Jeremiah is the prophet who wrote it, were under completely different circumstances. In fact, some of the context here is Israel ignored and disobeyed God. He had given them the law. You can read it in Genesis in the first 5 books, and they didn't listen. In fact, if anything, it's not just that they didn't listen, it's not just that they ignored or disobeyed, but they had become an evil nation. There was injustice and inequality all over the place. There was violence, and there was a horrible culture that Israel had built by ignoring and disobeying God. And God would judge them for their injustice. Jeremiah had spent the first 28 chapters all the way to 29 warning them that if they didn't follow the path God had laid out for them, the best one available, better than all the nations around them, because He loved them, that God would have to allow them to be punished and disciplined. And so Israel would have to turn back through that punishment and discipline. He allowed another country to come in to destroy them and take them away from their home, not to find a great ending at a whole bunch of good days because God's going to make us prosper and not harm us. In fact, some of the people that read this verse that were during Jeremiah's time would find out that their good days would end and they would spend a horrible time in a distant country away from the people they loved, and they would die there as slaves. That's not prospering them, and it's certainly harming them. But the context drives to us that God is judging injustice and bringing them back to Him through discipline. Context doesn't change the verse. It changes our understanding so we can live differently. Here's the last one, Matthew 7:1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. This is often coupled with somebody who feels pretty upset about the way they're living and how people are giving them attention for it. Usually it's something that's not great. Usually it's something that they don't even feel comfortable with. And it's often coupled with, only God can judge me. And what's ironic about that statement is, He will judge us. But this is a warning to us not to not judge, but the fact that by the standard we judge people, we will be judged. In fact, Matthew 7:2 says exactly that. Don't judge, warning, don't judge, or you too will be judged by the same standard that you judged other people. Now, context here is warning from a sermon, not a command. In fact, Paul says later on and writes to churches and the people that he ministered to, I have already judged this person, and I express that you should judge them too. In fact, it says later on as well that if you're a believer, we can judge that by the fruit of your life. Now, they're not contradictory. They're a warning from a sermon that calls out hypocrisy. So that if you're going to judge somebody, if you're going to be upset with what they're doing, if you're going to be not okay with how they live, then you had better make sure that you're not being a hypocrite. In fact, it enables us to grow together through what we call out. You're right. People shouldn't be lying. But let's make sure first that we hold to that standard before we call somebody else out for lying. It's not an excuse to let sin go. It's a call for the community of Jesus followers to live differently. And so context, it's not just important. Context creates clarity. I remember studying the Bible freshman year of college, and we had a doctor, Chuck Emmer, who was there, and he told us that context is king. It just doesn't create clarity. Context is king. We can go no farther than the clarity of our context, is what he told us. Context is king. Context creates clarity. If we don't have context, we can just assume things about the Bible. We'll assume things about what Jesus read. But if the Bible is there for us to know God, then it's way more important than we think, then we treat it, and it's too important for us to just guess at what it means. We need clarity. We need clarity desperately. In the same way, if you found a notebook and there was a letter written inside of it in your home, or on your desk, or in your car, if you found a note inside of a notebook and it said this, "Stop acting like a bully. I said I'm sorry. Why can't you just drop it?" And it wasn't addressed to you. In fact, you aren't quite sure who it was addressed to because it didn't say. It had a from, but not quite to who. Stop acting like a bully. I said I'm sorry. Why can't you just drop it? Would you assume that you're the bully and that you should stop acting like one? Would you start discovering things in your life that you haven't dropped and start giving them up and live in a totally different way and asking people around, am I less like a bully? No, that would be crazy. That would be ignorant, and that would be not true to the text that you found. In fact, you might start asking, this is a more rational approach, who is this written to? Where was this from? Why did they write these kinds of things? And what don't I understand about this letter that I should? But that's exactly what we do with the Bible. We read the Bible and we say, oh, God has a plan for me to prosper me and not harm me, and therefore I should live like God's going to prosper me and not harm me because he has a plan. But if we don't find clarity, we might be finding out that we're misquoting Scripture and we're not living according to what God says, which is, if you do find clarity, there's a richer and fuller understanding to his word. So yeah, God has a plan to prosper you and not harm you, but it starts by sacrifice. It starts with pain. It starts with giving up things that we hold to. It starts with getting correct in our relationship with Jesus. Now, the Bible is not full of, parts of the Bible are not rules for us to obey. If you read the Old Testament specifically and you start reading what Israel was called to, not every part of it is a rule for you to obey. Not every part of the Bible is an example for you to follow. And not every principle in the Bible is there for you to honor it. And not every person in the Bible is there for us to celebrate. There's some horrible characters in the Bible. There's some principles that countries followed that God said is no good. There's examples in the Bible that we are not supposed to follow but are there as cautionary tales. And there are rules in the Bible that do not apply to us anymore. Knowing the difference between the ones that aren't and the rules, examples, principles, and people that are come from context, and it can't be ignored. We can't ignore the context of where these scriptures come from. Now, that's a lot. That's a lot to hear. That's a lot to listen to. And frankly, instead of just reading the Bible casually, it sounds like a whole lot more work. But we need to take the Bible seriously. We need to take the Bible seriously even if we don't understand it immediately, because Jesus is the bedrock of our faith. And the way we learn about Jesus comes from the Bible. It reveals him to us. And so if we don't take it seriously because we don't understand it immediately, we are going to find parts of our faith, essences of the faith, foundations of the faith, hollow in our life. And we can't afford that. In our culture, with the people around us, with believers who walk with us in this life, we can't afford to have a shallow understanding of Jesus. We certainly can't have a shallow understanding of how to read the Bible that reveals Jesus to us. We need and must have a better understanding of the context of Scripture so that we can have a rich and full relationship with God. We need the faith of believers to be informed by the Bible so that we can be followers of Jesus for the next generation, because context creates clarity about God. We'll see you next time, guys.